I want to introduce to you a California native plant expert extraordinaire. And he's also a great hiking guide for native plants. And for over 40 years, he's been doing this. I want to introduce you, Manny Kaplan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard. Hello, everybody. Well, this is great to see such a turnout. As a fan and proponent of native plants, I'm thrilled to see so many people interested in learning more about it. Just to let you know the plan here, I've got about an hour and a half planned. We're going to take a virtual walk from the ocean up into the mountains, up into the Chaparral. So we've got probably 40 miles to cover, so we're going to have to keep the pace going. And then after that, I've got my bookstore here, and I know Green Thumb has a few books too, but then all the plants are here that we're going to be talking about. I also have an email list if you want to join the mailing list for herbwalks.com and get my monthly newsletter, and I'll be telling you more about my website and all the information there. Okay, so I think we can go ahead and get started. So how many of you are already growing at least one native plant in your yard? Oh wow, almost everybody. Oh, that is fantastic. Okay, well we're gonna bump up to the advanced class right away. No, just kidding. Speaking of that, I should tell you that my history with native plants goes back to 1967 when I was cured of a cold by a Native American man with a bag of tea. And this was the first I'd ever heard about herbal medicine, and that really piqued my interest. So it started a lifelong study. It's been going on since then. And then in 1976, I started leading what I call herb walks, these native plant interpretive walks. But it's one of these studies that the more you learn about it, the more you know how little you know. You know what I'm talking about? It's like that. It's just become a lifelong study, and I'm afraid I'm never going to live long enough to learn everything that I want to learn about it. Because once I started learning about the medicinal uses of plants and started going out hiking, backpacking, and studying our local native plants, because that's what was right here, was accessible to me, then I started learning about the edible plants. And then as years and years of doing these walks and teaching people how you can forage, what you can find in the wild to use for food and medicine, it gradually evolved to where I realized that I needed to start growing these plants and sharing about growing them, because yes, we could live off the wild. I mean, if all the power shut off, I can show you a couple of plants here today that could feed the masses. But that wouldn't last, maybe more than a few hours or a couple of days. There's like millions of us here in Southern California. There were 15,000 Chumash living here between Malibu and San Luis Obispo. So, I've been shifting my focus gradually to learning more about how to cultivate these plants at home. And when we go out in the wild, I focus on plants that are very common. We don't talk about harvesting any endangered plants or even rare plants. We focus on things that are abundant and that there is enough to feed the masses. All right, so those of you that are gardening with native plants, why did you decide to do that? Anybody want to raise your hand and offer? What is it that attracted you to growing a native plant? Yeah.
Encouraging animals and bees to pollinate from my yard.
Encouraging animals and insects to pollinate. In other words, enhancing the wildlife. And that is one of the great reasons for planting native plants, because the plants have co-evolved for literally millions of years with the insects, and then the insects are kind of the beginning of the food chain for all the other animals up the chain. So you are really contributing to that. Thank you for that. What's another reason that you are attracted to growing a native plant? Yes?
Conserving water in a lot of cases.
Conserving water. So how many of you have heard of the Mediterranean climate? All right, pretty much everybody. So very quickly, we live in the Mediterranean climate, which is one of the reasons why real estate is so darn expensive around here, because this is one of the most desirable climates for human habitation on the planet. Barring the occasional earthquake, we have it pretty good. Just look at the morning news every day and see what's going on. So what is the Mediterranean climate? It's long, dry summers and short, relatively mild winters. Basically, that's it. So we get at least 90% or more of our rain like between January and March. And then the plants have adapted to this long, basically, drought, an annual drought. Now, sometimes that drought can go on for years, and we've been experiencing that. And we're really not out of it yet, even though we had a couple of good winters. So these native plants have evolved with that climate. So many of them are adapted to going without water for long periods of time, which makes it perfect for our era now where we all have to be water-wise. I'm going to talk about some plants that happen to grow in wet places, so obviously they're not the drought-tolerant ones. Okay, good. So there's two good reasons for planting natives. Anyone else think of another good reason to favor native plants? Yes?
Actually, convenience.
Convenient.
Convenience. It's easy to take care of, maintain, and
They're, yeah, because they've evolved for so long, they've developed mechanisms to ward off predators, which is mostly insects. So very few of these plants need any kind of sprays. Most of them need no fertilizer. You just have to make sure that they've got the right kind of soil that they like, the right kind of drainage. Drainage is really important for a lot of these plants. And that you're planting them in the right place. So that brings me to the last reason I wanted to share for growing natives, which is when you have natives in your yard, you're creating a sense of place about where we live. Because most of us live in an urban environment, and we're surrounded by plants that have been brought here from all parts of the world, actually mostly from other places that have the Mediterranean climate, like South Africa, Australia. And we kind of lose sight of what's really growing native around here, other than, like, I'm standing in the native garden right here. But so by planting natives in your yard, you're beginning to create that sense of where you actually live, in addition to these other wonderful benefits that were mentioned. Okay, and also, native plants can be just as beautiful as other plants. Because we live in the Mediterranean climate, which has microclimates within it, some of us live in places where we can grow avocados. I mean, to me, one of the most delicious fruits on the planet. And we can grow pine trees and junipers that normally grow up at 7,000 feet. So we have a lot of choices, and Green Thumb has a lot of those choices here, but they have really led the way in stocking native plants. This is the largest collection of native plants that you're going to find in any nursery in Southern California, short of a botanic garden, like the Theodore Payne Garden in LA or the Santa Barbara Botanic Gardens. And a lot of that is thanks to Richard Flowers. Let's give Richard a hand for his tireless work in advocating for native plants. And also, just one more plug for Green Thumb. This is a local family-owned business. This is not a nationwide big box chain. And if you've gotten to know Richard and some of the other people that work here, you really get that personalized service here. So I'm a big fan, and I'm really honored to be here today. All right, here we go. We're going to dive into our walk. We're going to start down by the ocean and work our way up. So, I'm going to start with these plants right here. This is prickly pear. This is our native prickly pear, okay? This plant, the Opuntia genus, grows from California all the way across the United States. I was in South Carolina this summer, and I found prickly pears growing on the beach in South Carolina. And this is known as the original survival food for native people. When all else failed, when there was long periods of drought, and I don't want to scare you with how long some of the historical droughts have been, this plant continued to, if not thrive, at least survive and produce food. Anyone here familiar with the Mexican dish called nopalitos con huevos, or nopales, nopalitos? So that's made from the pads. These are actually stems. This doesn't have leaves. It's just made up of stems. It's a very unique kind of a growth. And then the stems, this is the original stem. They're called cladophylls. The original stem gets woody, and then it just keeps on putting out new pads. So you eat the young pads, and then when they get old enough to make fruit, then they make the prickly pears, which you can find right now. And that's where urban foraging comes in, because these are all over the place in people's yards, and most people, unless they're familiar with Mexican cuisine, aren't harvesting them. This is our native, and you can see lots of spines. So you don't want to put this next to the kitty jungle gym, okay? In fact, this is the kind, as much as I'm a huge fan of natives, this is the kind that I grow in my yard. I made an exception because I want something that's a little friendlier. This is a cultivar of Opuntia, and it's one of at least 60 that were created by a famous botanist named Luther Burbank. You heard of him? Yeah. He, among other things, he devoted himself to creating these different cultivars of spineless prickly pears. So, obvious advantage not having the spines, but the fruits will still have these little clusters of, they look like hairs around the spines. They're called glaucids. And those are actually worse than the spines because they're little tiny, tiny barbed hairs that will get in your skin and just irritate the heck out of you. And you have to get a magnifying glass and some tweezers maybe. There's all different techniques that people have for getting rid of them. And there's lots of information about how to harvest them, etc. But we got a lot of plants to cover. And like I said, we got at least 40 miles to go. So this is a plant that really prefers like a cactus mix. It's a cactus. They will grow on the beach. They will grow in virtually any part of our climate. They're up in the chaparral too, way up in the mountains. So they're very forgiving of different kinds of soils, but they definitely need drainage. They're drought tolerant. They don't need much water at all, but you'll see if they're not getting enough water, they'll just start to shrivel up a little bit. And they kind of tell you that they need a little more water. Birds, bees, love those as well. Let's see if I left out anything important I want to say about that. Oh, yeah, they don't have any diseases, but they do get an insect that's called a cochineal insect. It actually makes a red dye that if you artists are familiar with that cochineal red. Yeah, so you could grow them and grow your own cochineal, but it makes the plants look kind of unsightly because they get this white like fuzz all over them when the insects are inside that. And when you touch it, you get a red dye on your finger. So they get that, it seems like they get that if it's too foggy, if they're too damp. But if you keep them, if they get enough sun, they like to grow in full sun, basically, then they generally won't get that. Yes?
Can the infestation be bad enough to kill the plant?
I've never seen it kill them, but it can just completely cover them, and they just look kind of ugly unless, as I said, you're an artist who's purposely growing the insects. I mean, I grow milkweed for the monarchs, and I'm hoping that they're going to, eat it down to the stems. But that's the only plant that I grow, for the insects. So I haven't seen them do that, but I'm sure, enough of them maybe could stunt the growth anyway. Yeah. Okay. So staying along the coast, let's talk about some buckwheat. California buckwheat. This is California buckwheat right here. Eriogonum is the genus. fasciculatum is the species of this particular. This is our very common California buckwheat. And this one here is a species that grows on the Channel Islands. It's called St. Catherine's lace. And you can see how different the foliage is. So, you know, I'm not a landscaper. I'm a home gardener, and I'm going to share what I know. But they have experts here who can talk to you about, like, when you're designing your garden, coming up with different types of foliage, different contrasts that you want to have, etc. This mainly grows in what we call the coastal sage scrub, which is a plant community. So as we walk up into the mountains, we're going to be transitioning from one plant community to the next. So you've got your beach community, and then moving in from the beach, like right here, we're basically in what would naturally have been a coastal sage scrub community. And buckwheat is one of the plants you're going to find there. But the plants don't just stick to these maps that we make and we say, well, this is going to grow there. They'll grow wherever they can grow. They'll just keep on moving out and testing the waters, so to speak, or testing the soil. These will both grow on the mainland, even though it's native to the islands, because the islands also have mountains. The islands aren't all on the beach, you know, but they get a lot of salt spray, you know, I think, at least salty, moist air that we don't get on the mainland. This plant produces seed, lots of seed, and they're beautiful little white flower heads. They look like pom-poms to me, so that's how I describe them. Little white clusters. Then the clusters start getting speckled with rust-colored flowers as the flowers dry, and then the whole flower turns rust-colored. That's what you see this time of year if you go out on a hike. And those flower heads are full of seed. You just have to crush them up and separate the ground up dried flowers from the seed that's in there. And then you can actually grind that seed to flour, and you've got buckwheat flour. Is this the same as the buckwheat flour that you put in your buckwheat pancakes? Basically, yeah. It's not the same plant. That's a different genus in the same family. But for all intents and purposes, that is buckwheat flour. And this is extremely common. So when I said there are plants that could feed the masses, this is one of them. Buckwheat seed. After acorns, the most abundant food for native Chumash people. This one also actually makes bigger heads, but the flower clusters are smaller and the seeds get, they're just not quite, for me, they're not as good for eating, but I don't want to get into too many technical details here. So, buckwheat prefers full sun. Like most of these plants, it likes a well-drained soil. It has no pests or diseases. You can just let it kind of, it won't get much bigger than about that big across and that tall. I'm talking about the California buckwheat. This one tends to keep the leaves down lower, and then it sends up long flower stalks. You don't really have to prune it, but if you want to conserve space, you can keep it more compact just by pruning it back in the winter. And if you aren't harvesting the flowers, then the seeds will drop and it'll start sprouting little buckwheats, around the mother plant, and you can take those and transplant them and give them to your friends and become Johnny Buckwheat Seed, if you're so inclined. All right, any questions about buckwheat? Okay, so here's another plant. It wasn't really on my list, but this is a plant that grows really in the kind of the sandy, marshy areas right by the ocean. And because our coast has been so highly developed all through California, this yerba mansa, I don't know if it's considered endangered, but it's definitely lost a lot of its habitat. So, it's always nice to think in terms of the bigger environment and try to grow something that is being endangered so that you've got a little pocket of it, in your yard. And I thought about that when the fires burned through this area, and the birds, the insects, all they were left with was whatever native plants were growing in botanic gardens and people's yards. And so suddenly that became important for the environment. So yerba mansa is a colony plant. It spreads by rhizomes. It likes basically pretty wet soil, but it can handle the soil drying out some a little in the summer. But I have a friend who has a medicinal herb garden in Ojai, and she has a big patch of this up in the foothills of Ojai where it's really hot, but she keeps it watered. This is not a drought-tolerant plant. But it makes beautiful white cone-shaped flower heads. They stick up about that high. And it has several medicinal uses, including it's mostly used for tooth and mouth issues. It's kind of an anesthetic to the mouth. So that's yerba mansa. Then, let's see, what do we have? Oh yeah, so continuing in the coastal sage scrub community, we've got a couple of species of sage, and this is where the coastal sage scrub community gets its name. I guess the buckwheat bushes provide the scrub, and the purple sage and the black sage, where did the black sage go? The purple sage and the black sage provide the sage part of the scrub, of the coastal sage scrub. So Richard is looking for some black sage right now, which he'll find in a minute. This is, oh yeah. You know what? I'm going to pass this around. Don't pick any leaves off of it. This is for sale. And don't crush the leaf, but just gently rub the leaf and smell your fingers. And then I'm going to find out what you think. Do you have any more of those, Richard? Okay, I know I saw a black sage here when we were setting up. Okay, there's another purple sage. We'll start over at this end. So as I said, just gently rub the leaf and see what you think. Does it remind you of any spices or herbs? Sage, maybe? Good, all right, that's what I was looking for. Okay, I haven't bought sage for years and years. The purple sage is the one that you can use for cooking. Fortunately, there's plenty growing, but when it gets into foraging, there are also issues of legalities and all sorts of things, and learning about what we call sustainable foraging, which you can find out about on my website, herbwalks.com. Okay, and here's the black sage. All right, I won't pass this one around, but a similar smell, but what I would call a muskier smell. It's a very much stronger aroma. Very few people cook with the black sage, but I know people that are doing really fantastic things. There's a woman who's going to be presenting a amazing dinner at the Ojai Herbal Symposium, which I'm going to tell you about as we go on here. That's coming up November 16th and 17th. She makes black sage chocolate truffles that are just out of this world. Because peppermint goes well with chocolate, right? And sage is in the mint family. So it turns out it also goes well with chocolate. In fact, many of the mint family plants go well with chocolate. So this is a plant that also likes to grow in the full sun. And I'm talking about both purple sage and black sage. Their needs are pretty much the same. They're drought tolerant. But all of these native plants, when they're first getting started, you want to give them some water the first year. And usually what's recommended is a deep watering every month or 2 months. You don't want to just come by and just, sprinkle the ground. They need that deep watering. And some of the experts on growing natives recommend actually using sprinklers rather than drip irrigation, because it's more like the natural moisture that the plants get, because they do get their moisture from rain and fog. A lot of these plants are adapted to picking up enough moisture from fog that's what helps them get through that long rain-free summer that we have. And also mulching really helps with all these plants, because in the wild, when you see them growing in nature, there's always mulch. There's always mulch around these plants. There's no such thing as always for anything, but almost all the time there's dead leaves and twigs and all sorts of stuff on the ground, which is just that natural mulch. So I know everybody's hip to mulch these days. Let's see. Yeah, so they will tolerate all different soil types, because we have places here on the coast that have sandy soil, but we also have some places. How many of you have clay soil? Yeah, there's actually quite a bit of clay soil along here too. So I'm sure if you're gardeners, most of you probably are gardeners, which is why you're here. So you've learned how you have to amend your soil one way or the other. These are pretty tolerant of all those different soil types. But that influences the watering. So if you have this in a heavier clay soil, you're not going to need to water it those first couple of years as much as you would if it's in a sandier soil. And then if it's in really sandy soil, you may have to keep giving it a little extra water, every year. These just, as a lot of the native plants do, these go into kind of a summer dormancy rather than a winter dormancy. Once they make their seeds, which is fairly early, like June, then they kind of shut down for the summer. That's how they deal with the long summer. They take a long siesta, like for a few months. And the leaves just kind of turn yellow, and they don't look that great. But you can keep them looking good with that extra water through the spring. Generally, rule of thumb, it's better to water natives, and especially like oaks, which I'll get to, during the time that they're normally getting water. You just supplement the water that they're already getting during those, between October and April is when we have a likelihood of getting some kind of rain. So you start giving them extra water in the fall if we haven't had any early rain, and then if we haven't had much winter rain, you can continue to give them some water through the spring. And then you generally, once they're established, you cut off the water in the summer, which is the beauty of, as was mentioned, of being able to conserve water with these natives. Butterflies love the purple sage. So if you're thinking about plants to attract butterflies, that is a great one. And they both produce copious amounts of seed, which you can eat. Chia is a sage. Chia seed comes from a sage, which we actually have growing up in the mountains here. You don't find it much in native plant nurseries, but the point being that sage seed is edible, and they're delicious. But they're also eaten by many different kinds of birds, including songbirds. So these are wonderful for attracting butterflies and birds to your garden. Okay, purple and black sage. Any questions so far? Yes. Yeah. Did you hear the question? She just moved to Ventura. She has a plant that smells like sage. Can she assume that it's sage? No. But here's what you can do. You can get my card, and my email address is on there. Take a nice clear photo of the plant, at the whole plant, and then a close-up of leaves or if there's any flowers, and email that to me, and I'll do my best to tell you what it is. And also, on my website, herbwalks.com, which is on the cards, and it's on this list, I have a page of resources, free resources, which I've spent hundreds of hours creating links to all kinds of websites on growing native plants, identifying native plants, using them for food, for medicine, where you can find, nurseries with the plants. Yeah, okay, there's a bigger elderberry tree right there. There's a little one underneath it, right here. That sage still going around the crowd? Yes. Yeah. You like that smell? Nice, huh? Okay. There's a little elderberry tree. And again, we're still in the coastal sage scrub community. These tend to grow in the outer reaches of the floodplain. So you can find them all along the avenue, which is really basically old Ventura River floodplain. As you go up heading to Ojai, and then in the Ventura River Preserve and up into the valleys. They'll grow, a little ways up into the mountains, but not too far. They're mostly, lower elevation. How many of you have ever tried an elderberry syrup, wine, liqueur, cough syrup? Right. So I think of all the plants here today, this is becoming the most famous medicinal herb. It's used a lot in Europe, and Europeans are way ahead of us on recognizing the value of these natural medicines that don't have all the side effects. And you can even see a clip on YouTube of a doctor on Good Morning America, one of those weird alternative hippie stations, right? ABC, Good Morning America. A doctor talking about using elderberry syrup to combat the flu in the winter, to prevent the flu or reduce the symptoms of flu from using a syrup made from the elderberries, also a tea from the flowers. So this is a very important medicinal tree, and these will become quite a large tree if they grow long enough. There's one growing, the biggest one I've ever seen is growing by Lake Casitas on a trail along the edge of the lake, and the trunk is literally like that big around. Yeah. That tree, probably 75 years old, maybe even older. Yeah. A lot of these plants can get pretty big, but because we live in a natural fire ecology, they rarely live to their full life expectancy because they burn, and then they're adapted to that. So it's all part of nature's plan. All right, so elderberries are also, birds love these. I have a friend who has one growing right next to his chicken coop, and he just tosses the berries in there for the chickens, and they go crazy. Let's see. What else did I want to say? Yeah, so they, you can keep them pruned in your yard to keep them from getting, 40 feet tall, like they can if they reach their full size. And they'll grow in some shade, especially the further you get from the coast. They don't mind some shade, but down here in the Ventura area, they like full sun, and that's where you'll see them growing naturally. So let me just interject that, not just a plug for my herb walks, but just in general, if you want to grow native plants, you need to get out and see, if you can, if you're physically able to, get out and see where they're growing naturally, and then try to emulate that environment in your yard, knowing that they are able to live in quite a wide range of environments. But when you spend enough time, you get to see where they generally like to be, where they're thriving. Because that's what I'm always looking for. If I'm harvesting a plant for food or medicine, I want the strongest, healthiest, most vigorous plant I can find, because I'm looking for life force, for energy, and that's what you want in your plants in your yard too. So they'll tolerate a variety of soil types, but they prefer a neutral, rich loam. So some really nice soil, which is again why they like to grow in the floodplain, because that's what they're getting in the floodplain is that loamy, natural loamy soil. They have no serious pests or diseases. You can cut them all the way back to the ground if you want to in the winter, because like this one's getting kind of leggy, which they will do. That one's probably been in the pot for a while. I don't want to comment on that too much, but but the I didn't bring my stick with me, but I have a called a clack stick. It's a Chumash instrument, a percussion instrument that's made from a elderberry branch about that long, and it's hollowed out, and then it makes this really interesting percussive sound. So you need a long, straight branch to make one of those, and that was a very important instrument for the traditional Chumash. And I mentioned them in the past tense only in the sense of traditional Chumash who were living here in villages 500 years ago. There are still Chumash among us, but I don't know any that are still living in their traditional huts and foraging all their food. So they would burn these back to the ground or cut them back to the ground to get new growth, because the new branches come up really straight, and that's what they were looking for. So you can do that, or you can just prune them to fit the shape of your yard. And there's books. I've got a couple of books here on native plant gardening in my bookstore, and there's plenty online, and there are other books here too, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay, that's what I wanted to say about elderberry. Any questions? Okay, good. We're going to move along. Okay, continuing in the coastal sage scrub, this is coffeeberry. You can't make coffee with it. It's called coffeeberry because it kind of looks a little like a coffee plant, and the berries look like coffee beans. So I assume that's how it got its name. This plant will grow in a variety of different habitats. I see it generally growing in some shade, but it'll grow in full sun as well. And it grows up into the mountains, but not way up generally into the chaparral. It does best in full sun, and if you're going to plant it in sandier soil, it is going to need some water, but otherwise it's generally drought tolerant. And this is one that can use some fertilizer. I'm not sure what it is about it, but it likes a little fertilizer. So yeah, this is going to make a nice shrub right here. This grows into a pretty good sized shrub. I don't know if I have the dimensions here. I don't, but it'll get pretty big, but you can prune it very easily, prune it back to shape, and the berries are edible. If you eat too many, they're laxative. In fact, the bark is a traditional California Indian laxative remedy, a tea of the bark. It's called sacred bark. Yeah. And you'll see this time of year, well, through the summer actually, the coyote scats are full of the seeds of the coffee berry, so they eat a lot of these berries to balance out their diet. So there's a natural source of fruit, and it is edible, though I didn't want to scare you about the laxative side of it. Okay, it's listed here as Rhamnus californica, but that is one name among others that has been changed in recent years because of research, because of DNA research that has really revolutionized the whole system of taxonomy, of identifying plants, because now we really know what they're connected to, what they're related to. So they renamed this plant Frangula californica, but nerdy plant stuff. Yeah, and here's some spurge growing in here. So I can't help it. I'm gonna leave it out. Okay, there's the coffee berry. There's some weeds. Spurge, is also an herb you can use to remove warts. When you break it off in your garden, it has that white sap that comes out of it. That sap will burn warts off your skin. But you have to put like Vaseline around the wart, and then you put the sap right on the wart, and it'll hurt. It'll literally burn it. You could do the same thing with fig sap. There was a fig tree here earlier. Yeah, it's right back there. Yeah, when you break a fig off, there's a white sap that comes out. Same stuff. It's kind of a natural latex, and it has a caustic. Oh yeah, so that reminds me, I should give you my disclaimer. I forgot. My wife always reminds me to do that when she's here. I'm not a doctor. So anything that I say about using these plants to eat or medicinally, I'm telling you what I do or what I would do or what I could do, but I'm not telling you to do it. You're entirely on your own. But I will say that people do use these things. Some of you probably do too. How many of you have ever taken an herbal supplement? How many of you have never taken an herbal supplement? Okay, 1, 2, all right. Good, well, I applaud your health. And maybe you have and you didn't realize it. Like maybe you use an Altoid, breath freshener or something, which has peppermint in it, which is an herb. All right, moving on from coffee berry. Okay, I think it's time that we talk about the king of the native plants, or the queen, however you want to look at plants. I guess Las Plantas is feminine, so I guess the plants are feminine. So the queen of the native plants, the coast live oak. This is like the cornerstone of the ecosystem around here. These, Ventura, Ojai, all of these valleys were once oak woodlands. They say in Ojai that a squirrel could go from one end of the valley to the other without ever touching the ground. Back in the day. And between all the insects that live on these plants, and they don't kill it, but they live on it, and then the animals that eat those insects, and between the animals that eat the acorns, the birds, and the deer, this plant provides so much food for the environment. And they're, hi Janelle, do you have a seat? Richard, are there any more chairs? They are obviously not as many as there used to be. I mean, I'm sure there are still 1,000 oaks in Thousand Oaks, but I don't know. I haven't done a count yet, but maybe there aren't anymore. But certainly at one time there were thousands of oaks in Ventura County. This one is, does anyone know why it's called a live oak? The other ones aren't dead. It's because it doesn't lose its leaves. It's evergreen. So it looks like it's alive all year round. And there's a southern live oak that does the same thing, but this is our California coastal live oak, it's called, Quercus agrifolia, of the genus Quercus of the beech family. So beech nuts are related to acorns, and the acorns are a nut. They're a true nut, which Quercus, Quercus, Quercus agrifolia. Now, it's a big commitment to grow one of these. You have to have a big enough property to grow one, and you have to be prepared to live in the shade for the rest of your life. So I have mixed feelings because I was very fortunate to be able to buy a little house in Miners Oaks, and it has a couple of oak trees on it. So I love to garden, And I have this, couple of little sunny patches, and the rest is under oak shade. So I'm, growing the shady native plants. And then I like to garden, so I've got, the compost pile gets the best sunny spot in the backyard, because I got to have compost if I'm going to be an organic gardener. And then I have my vegetables. So, but of course, then when it's super hot, that shade is such a nice thing to have, and all the wildlife, that comes with them. They are very particular about their watering. So, those of you, does anyone actually have a live oak on their property? Not too many, a few. I would certainly encourage you to grow one if you're prepared to make that commitment, if you have the space. But they're particular about watering. They don't like to be watered within 6 or 8 feet of the trunk. But then outside of there, they love water. In fact, the only places you're going to find oaks in Ventura County, other than the 2, or I guess it's 1 now, up at the 2 trees, those are oaks, right? Little oaks up there. They're growing in the canyons, or at least in the watershed of the canyons. So they're in that environment where they're getting the coastal moisture coming up from the ocean, and their roots are able to get down into the water table. They do need a lot of water. That being said, they're basically drought tolerant, not drought resistant. They can't live in sustained drought. We lost a number of oaks over the last few years because of the drought. But they are drought tolerant. They can handle the drought. They've evolved with drought and with the long summers, but they really like those wet winters. So you can supplement the watering for oaks in the fall and through the winter, depending on how much natural rainfall we're getting. And then you cut it off in the summer. Okay. Well, any questions about oaks? Let me see if I left out anything important here. Well, you've seen them around. They get pretty big. So, they'll get up to 75 feet high and 60 feet wide. And they also don't like, They also don't like sun directly on the trunk. So when you see them growing naturally, the branches tend to come almost down to the ground. So they're creating this canopy around themselves to keep the sun off the trunk. And then the seedlings start up underneath in that shade and in that protection. And then eventually when the mother plant dies, then they get their moment in the sun. Yes?
So I often find them in pots. They're growing. The little trees are growing in pots, but I think the squirrels just see the
Yeah, right.
And I try to transplant them, but they don't never make it.
Yeah, they very quickly put out a long taproot, and once you break them off and try to get them out of the pot, it's really hard to transplant them. Yeah, it's tricky. It's not hard to grow them just by putting an acorn in a pot, just like the squirrels and the birds.
They always grow, but I don't want them.
Yeah, I know.
Space.
Yeah, I know. I have the same issue. Yeah, I mean, if you can get down, if it hasn't sent the taproot down too far, you can get all the dirt around it, you can do it, but it's tricky. But I applaud you for trying. Yes? Okay, the question was basically what's the best way to water them, knowing that they don't want water within 6 or 8 feet. Okay, they will do great if you put rocks around them for 6 or 8 feet just to make sure that you're not growing anything there, or mulch. By the way, the best thing for them is just oak leaf mulch. I just leave the oak leaves down, around them. I mean, to some people that looks messy, but to me, I know I'm creating this ideal habitat for them, because that's just preserving whatever moisture is in that soil, with that mulch. So They're designed in nature to shed water out to the canopy. If you've studied an oak leaf, they have this curved shape, right? And all the leaves are curved like that. And so it's like shingles on a roof. The water hits the top leaves and it rolls off, and then it hits the next leaf, and it sheds all the water out to the canopy because they don't want the water underneath. So that's how they take care of it naturally. So you can have sprinklers on outside of that 6 or 8 foot zone. You can be watering your other plants with sprinklers. You could. That would probably be the best way. I mean, just let them take advantage of whatever water you're using outside of that. That's percolating down into the ground. They do great with a lawn nearby. Not that I'm a big advocate of lawns, but if you have, access to plenty of water and you want to grow a lawn, that's your prerogative. They do great getting that kind of water from a nearby lawn. Okay, any other questions about the mighty oak? From the little acorn grows the mighty oak. Yeah, I could go, maybe you got the idea. I could go on and on talking about any one of these plants, as I do on the trail. So I have herb walks where we do less walking and more talking. And then I have nature hikes where we do more walking and less talking. Okay, let's see. All right, so we're still, okay, the oaks will grow, they won't grow right by the beach, but they'll grow anywhere from Ventura, up in, the further you go in the mountains, the more you find them deep in the canyons, right near the water. But as you get out closer to the coast and in the valleys, you'll find them growing away from the creeks. But we're still in walking through the coastal sage scrub. So another key plant of the coastal sage scrub is Artemisia. And we have several Artemisias here, right? The Artemisia californica. We've got, this one is just your basic Artemisia. This is called California sagebrush. Okay, I'll get to that one next. Yeah, and here's a cultivar of Artemisia that's a ground cover. So this one stays low, which is really great feature to have because this can get to be quite a big bush, although you can see they've already pruned this back a little bit, it looks like. And you can keep it in a nice compact shape like that. Or you have this ground cover variety. Okay, let me see which one has some aroma to it. I think I lost my piece of paper I had under this. Oh, this is it. Let's see if this one smells. Yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, I'll pass this around like I did with the sage. You have any more of these handy right here? Artemisia? Yeah, that's one right there. Yeah, so you can start that one over there. So just gently kind of fondle these leaves here and see if you can get a little scent from it. I think they get much stronger aroma when they're growing in full sun. I suspect this is not in full sun all the time. I don't know. Well, they'll get like this big across and this tall if they're just left to grow, but you can prune them. Yeah, they prune very easily. Well, this one is a ground cover. So it just, you just kind of let it sprawl out on the ground. So that, yeah, it does. Yeah. So it won't, you won't smell it just walking by it. But if you come up and rub the leaves, they used to call this cowboy cologne because the cowboys would rub themselves down with this stuff before they hit the saloon when they came in off the range. Back in the day before everybody took a shower once or twice a day. And it has wonderful medicinal properties. Yes.
I live in the foothills, and I was reading about fire-resistant plants, and this was one that was mentioned. Is that true?
Okay, the question was, is this a fire-resistant plant? Generally, yeah, I would say yes, it is. If it's not, they get kind of dry in the fall. So this time of year, unless it's getting some water, you can keep them looking like this into the fall if you keep giving them some water. But generally, they get kind of dry. So any dry plant is likely to ignite with an ember. But generally, they're not oily. They're not an oily, flammable plant in general. Now, the whole subject of fire-resistant landscapes, in a nutshell, yeah, people say, just get rid of all the plants. Okay, but Green Thumb wouldn't want me telling you that. And actually, that's not the best approach. The best approach is to keep all the flammable stuff, all the dry litter and so forth away from your house, which unfortunately does include wood mulch, and have plants there like this that will absorb some of the embers, because it's the flying embers, as we all know too well now, that spread the fires. They'll absorb some of the flying embers and maybe keep them from hitting your house. So there is some benefit to having a few plants in your yard, especially plants that you're watering or that are naturally retaining moisture even without water. Does that make sense? Yeah. They're both Artemisia californica. So it's not a sage. Its name is sagebrush, but it's not a true sage. The sages are the genus Salvia. This is Artemisia. This one is Artemisia californica. Canyon Gray is the cultivar. It's the same genus and species, but it's a cultivar from a native species that grows near the coast. Because things that grow near the coast with a lot of wind tend to stay lower to the ground, so their branches don't just get broken all the time. Question, can you use this for cooking? No. This is extremely bitter. It doesn't taste anything like sage. It's medicinal, and it's actually toxic in any large quantity that you were to ingest. It has been used, as a mild tea, but it's from a group of plants called the wormwoods, and the one that grows in the Mediterranean is called wormwood. That's the original, Artemisia, Artemisia absinthium, that the liqueur absinthe is made from, which has kind of intoxicating effects, which has the word toxic in it. And they've been traditionally used for getting rid of worms, parasites. So those are usually very bitter plants that are, if they're toxic enough to kill the parasites, they're probably toxic enough to kill you if you took too much. So not a sage. Yes?
How high is that?
This one here, it doesn't get much higher than that right there. Yeah, this is a prostrate ground cover. It sprawls, yeah.
Is it a fast grower?
Is it a fast grower? I'm not sure. The ones that I've seen, they didn't look like they were growing real fast, but I can't answer that question authoritatively. Yeah. What's that? It's also full sun, but it'll grow in some shade, but it prefers the sun. And it'll definitely grow faster in the sun. And it is drought tolerant, so it is adapted to growing in the sun. But the important thing to remember is even though the word sage is in its name, it's not a sage. It's sagebrush. Yeah, it needs no fertilizer. It has no serious pests or diseases. You can cut it back as much as you want. You can keep it compact. Grows best in full sun, but will tolerate fog and moisture. Okay, let's see. How are we doing on time? Oh, okay. All right, we haven't even got out of the coastal sage scrub yet. We better pick up the pace. So we've got. Let's see. Here's another plant that actually looks a lot. The leaves look a lot like the Artemisia, with finely dissected leaves, and it's in the same family as the Artemisia. This is yarrow. Yarrow, in our where it grows native here, it generally grows in the shade and in the north-facing canyons. It's not real common in this area. It's much more common north of here where there's more rain. So it's not. It doesn't take nearly as much water as a lawn, but it's not one of your really drought-tolerant plants. But I've seen a beautiful lawn of this growing in Ojai. You have to water it with a sprinkler, just like a lawn. Not as much as you'd need to water a lawn, but it's the foliage stays pretty low to the ground, and then it puts up flower stalks with beautiful kind of umbels, umbrella-shaped white clusters of flowers. It's another medicinal plant. Among other things, it stops bleeding. And it has many uses. It's a very widely used herbal medicine, Achillea millefolium. So this is one that you could think about as a lawn substitute, not necessarily a whole lawn that you're going to play on, but if you want that kind of a lawn texture in your garden design, this is an excellent choice. Yarrow. Yeah, it does. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it also spreads from a root system. Yeah. So, while we're on a colony plant like that, let's talk about mugwort, because we just left the Artemisia, and this is another Artemisia. Any more mugwort? I don't know. Oh, yeah, okay, good. So mugwort is, any questions, more questions about yarrow before we, yeah. I think kind of a loamy soil, a nicer soil than you would generally grow, sage and some of these other natives. Yeah, I think yarrow would benefit for some pretty good soil. Let me see if I have any. No, I didn't have any other notes on it. Yeah, it would. Well, let's see what they say on here. It just says sun or light shade. Yeah, it will definitely grow in the shade, especially as you get further inland. So things that grow in full sun in Ventura might like some shade in Ojai. But yeah, I would say a soil similar to what you grow other vegetables and things in your yard, other flowers. Okay, so this is in the same genus Artemisia as the sagebrush, but quite a different plant. The Artemisia is a bush that propagates from the seed sprouting nearby. This propagates from the root system. It makes seed, and occasionally the seeds will also germinate, but because it naturally grows in the leaf litter under the oak trees in the canyons, it has evolved to propagate from the root system, spreading out under those leaves and then popping up through the leaves. So it's drought tolerant, but you can water it through the summer and keep it looking green. Or you can just let it do its natural thing, which is to be very vigorous and green in the spring, and then in the summer it flowers, and you don't really even see the flowers; they're very tiny. And then it just kind of dries up, and you can cut it back at almost any point once it's done flowering. And the idea ultimately with designing your native plant garden is you get to know when these plants are shining, when they're having their moment of the year. Some of them flower in the spring, some of them flower in the fall. And there's different times of year. Some of them go into summer dormancy, some of them are perennial evergreens. So you want to plan so that if you're deciding that you want to just cut this back before it gets scraggly and looking dry in the fall, you have something else growing next to it that's going to take over that space and provide something. So let me show you, like right now, what one of those plants might be. I'll take a little detour. Oh, well, no, I'll get to that. Where's the Zauschneria? That's a name that just rolls off your tongue, isn't it? If you're German. Zauschneria is a common name, which I'll confuse you with. It's called California fuchsia. It's not a fuchsia. It's not even related to fuchsia. But the flowers look like fuchsia, so they call it California fuchsia. And it flowers now. It flowers in the fall. It's one of the few that does. It has these beautiful, long, red-orange, tubular flowers, kind of like fuchsia flowers, and the hummingbirds are California fuchsia. Now, its common name is its old. Oh, this is getting confusing. Its common name, Zauschneria, is its old Latin name, but it's not Zauschneria anymore since the DNA. Now it's Epilobium. So now you're really confused. Boy, I tell you, some of this is. But I'm giving the California fuchsia as an example of something you could plant in amongst your mugwort. It also will grow in sun or shade. And I've seen it actually mostly in the shade in Ventura County. There's some that was growing in Arroyo Verde Park. There was a pretty good patch of it there. I haven't been back to that patch since the fire, so I don't know if it's still there. But it was growing in shade. So you've got this, which doesn't make flowers, but it's got lots of nice foliage in the spring and summer. And then in the fall, this starts making its flowers, so you could cut this one back, and then you've got these around it. Just an example of some companion planting that you could do there.
Do they have medicinal uses too?
This one has some kind of obscure uses that I've read about, but I know the Tongva people in Los Angeles area used it, but I've never actually used it myself. This I've used quite a bit, the mugwort. For one thing, mugwort is the only tried and true treatment for poison oak rash that I've used myself, and many people have reported using to treat poison oak rash, because it has an almost instant calming effect on the itching, and that's half the battle. If you can deal with the itching, then you're not going to scratch it and spread it. But it's a wonderful. This is one of the plants I can stand on the trail and talk about half an hour about mugwort and how they use it in acupuncture and Chinese medicine. It's called moxa. Anyone ever heard of moxa? Yeah. And the tea is used for colds, on and on. So I grow this under my oak tree. I got some seed. You can buy them here, but I got some seed and just planted some seed in a flat, and then a bunch of them sprouted, and I put them in the ground, and now they just spread. In fact, I have to, if I were to do it over again, I would use a root barrier. You know, the plastic. You sell root barriers here, right, Richard?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Some of these, like the colony plants, like the mugwort, a root barrier can really help keep them from spreading where you don't want them to spread. So I grow it under my oak tree with hummingbird sage, one of my very favorite plants. Yeah. Okay. These, I guess because they're in a nursery, I don't know. They don't have quite the pungent aroma that they have in the wild, but you get the idea. So this is a true sage. This is a salvia. It's related to the purple sage, the black sage, white sage, which we haven't gotten to yet because we have to get all the way up in the mountains to get to that. But this is a shade plant. It's the only true salvia, true sage that likes to grow in the shade. So if you do have that situation, you can see the new growth down here. So it'll put up a stalk like that after a while. This might even be, a year old. And then once it's done flowering with these magnificent, long, beautiful red flowers, it's called hummingbird sage because the flowers are so long that hummingbirds are the only animal that can get in there. So it's a fantastic plant to have for hummingbirds. It has a wonderful aroma, which I'm going to pass this one around so you can do the smell test here. No, it stays very low to the ground. Yeah, it's a very low growing plant. The flower stalks will maybe get up a couple of feet high. And then you just cut those back whenever they're done flowering. Now, I just keep giving mine a little water through the summer and they stay green. But in the wild, where they get no water, they just gradually kind of shrivel up in the summer. So if you're just let it do that in your yard, then you just cut it back after it's flowered. And then when the first rains come, or around that time, you can start watering it again. Like right now, October, you can start watering native plants. And then it'll come back with that vigorous growth, and it'll spread its roots out. It makes a wonderful tea. What's that? If you have to get a piece of root with it. Yeah, you can break off the yes, yeah, you can transplant them pretty easily that way. That one I also started from seed, the one that I have. Let's see, what was I going to say? Oh yeah, so I know, by the way, this was advertised as going until noon, and I will be here as long as you want to stay, but feel free to leave anytime if you have places to go, people to see, and things to do. This book right here is one that I recommend if you're interested in the medicinal uses of plants. This is Healing with Medicinal Plants of the West by Dr. James Adams and his Chumash teacher, Cecilia Garcia. So you get the Chumash lore of the traditional Chumash uses of the plants, and then you have Dr. Adams, who's a pharmacologist at USC, who would tell you all the chemicals that are in the plant, the phytochemicals, the naturally occurring phytochemicals, and he takes these plants into the lab with his graduate students, and he analyzes them and figures out what is in this plant that makes it do what the Chumash say it can do. So you get the ancient wisdom and the modern science behind it in this book. And Dr. Adams will be one of the speakers at the Ojai Herbal Symposium on November 16th and 17th. And I have cards, lots of cards about that here. He will be speaking on the medicinal benefits of plant terpenes. Raise your hand if you know what terpenes are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, quick lesson on terpenes. You know that smell of the sage that you smelled? That's terpenes. We call them aromatic oils or essential oils. Those are terpenes. You know turpentine? The smell? Well, that's from pine. Pines are loaded with terpenes. So just about any plant that has a strong aroma, the chances are it's coming from terpenes. And they're, what?
Smell it?
Yeah, if you can smell it, it's probably, spell, yeah. Terpene. Terpenes. And many plants' medicinal properties are in the terpenes. So quick lesson on that too. It's really interesting. Why do the plants make terpenes? Why do they need to make a smell? Like, what's the value of it? Not to attract insects, to repel insects. Yeah, the terpenes are very unpleasant for the insects. They're very powerful, pungent they don't like them. So most of the medicines that we get from plants are from the parts of the plants that the plants created to keep predators away. But humans over time learned how to use these plant parts to make medicine or to flavor their food. Okay, so yeah, Dr. Adams, and oh yeah, so the reason I thought of him was in this book he has a recipe for a tea for anxiety, because some of the terpenes are anti-anxiety. A tea for anxiety made with Mexican chocolate and hummingbird sage. And it is, I mean, just chocolate tea is pretty good to begin with, but you know, the chocolate mint kind of idea, the combination is amazing. I don't know what it is, but it definitely takes the edge off. You will not be feeling any anxiety after you have a cup of that tea. Okay, boy, all right. Let's get to another one of my favorites from the coastal area, then we better head up in the mountains. Is this another one? No. Okay, this is lemonade berry. Anyone familiar with lemonade berry? Okay, good. Lemonade berry likes to grow here by the coast. In fact, you won't find it growing up in Ojai. We have its cousin up there. Richard, do we have Rus ovata here today? This has a cousin of the same genus, Rus, of the sumac family, that's called Rus ovata, which is sugar bush, which grows inland. Lemonade berry likes to grow by the coast. There's a lot of it in Arroyo Verde Park, as a matter of fact. And there's a lot, Santa Barbara near the ocean, not right on the beach, but near the ocean. It'll grow in light shade, but generally likes the sun. It'll get to be a pretty good sized woody shrub, 8 to 10 feet high, if you let it. Or with almost all these plants, you can keep them cut back. But the wonderful thing about it is, first it flowers, so it's covered with beautiful pink flowers. Then it makes the berries. If you like the sour taste, if you like the taste of a sour apple, if you like lemonade, you will love lemonade berry. In fact, that's why it's called lemonade berry. Many of the sumac plants make these tart berries, and in the Middle East, any people with heritage from the Middle East who are familiar with an herb called sumac? Sumac, yeah. Sumac this is it. This is sumac, the sumac family. Sumac it grows around the world, and they dry the berries and they grind it and they make this wonderful tart, slightly salty seasoning for vegetables, for meat, all kinds of things. I like to just suck on them and then chew them up, spit the seeds out. You can put a handful of them in a water bottle and shake it up, and you've got instant natural lemonade. And every time you eat any of these native foods, you're getting what we call micronutrients. You're getting trace amounts of minerals and vitamins, especially the minerals that you just don't get in cultivated food, even from an organic farm. You're not necessarily getting some of these trace elements that we'll find in the wild. And if you grow them in your garden, they will pull, those nutrients are there, and you can get native plant soil mixes now. We used to have to plant our natives in cactus soil, but now they make native plant soil mix. In fact, Green Thumb, I think, has more than one brand of native plant soils. So Richard is going around now. He's handing out the raffle tickets, huh?
Yes.
Okay, we're getting to that time. Thank you for sticking around for so long. There's some empty chairs that opened up over here too, if some of you want to come sit in the shade. Lemonade berry. Let me see if I missed anything else I wanted to say about that. Well, I think that's about it. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question. With the lemonade berry, I've noticed that when the seeds or the you know, I guess it's the seed that is the tasty part.
Yeah.
The more larger they are and the older they are in the parks, they tend to be covered with something that looks dirty. Is that the pollution and the dirt from around, or is that naturally occurring from the plant?
Okay, the question was, she made a very astute observation. The berries on the lemonade berry, they just stay on there for a long time. I mean, some birds do eat them, but they'll be on there for a long time, so they're very sticky berries. So over time, they will pick up dust that's around, and so they look kind of unsightly, but it's not a mold or a mildew. It's just collecting dust and dirt, that's around. So they're definitely better, before they've been on the bush for a couple of months. The berries, generally in the early to midsummer, depends, where you are, is when you'll find the berries. But they're really fun, and they're evergreen. Doesn't lose its leaves. Almost all of these are evergreens that we've been talking about. Okay. Another favorite of mine, and this is just a baby, so it doesn't really tell you what a nice big shrub or tree this can get to be. It says here 8 to 20 feet high, 10 to 20 feet wide. This is toyon, Heteromeles arbustifolia, or toyon is a little easier to remember, which is the Spanish name. Toyon, interestingly, is in the rose family. So if you know the rose family, anybody know what other trees are in the rose family? Trees in the rose? Apples, peaches, the stone fruits, plums, cherries, apricots, almonds, pears, and then some of our berries, strawberries, blackberries, raspberries. Anybody like the rose family? Yeah. Well, these make berries too, and they are in the winter. It's the only thing you're going to find with beautiful red berries on it in the winter, which is why people cut these, even though they shouldn't. They cut the branches with the red berries and they make home Christmas wreaths out of these. So one of its common names was Christmas berry, and another name because of the, you see how the leaves have spines on the edge of the leaf? Not, they're not going to hurt you, but, the kind of sawtooth edge on the leaf. So it reminded people from the East Coast of holly, and it had red berries, but holly is poisonous, and we don't have it out here. So they called it California holly. Well, there was a lot of it. It likes to grow in our foothills, and there was a lot of it growing in the Hollywood Hills, and that's one of the stories of how Hollywood got its name, from the California holly. So I harvest the berries in like January, February when they're fully ripe, and then I dehydrate them, and they make these really tasty little dried berries that people love. They kind of taste like a dried apple or a dried cherry, because they're in that family. And I have one of these also in my yard. It grows in the shade in my yard, but they prefer sun, but they will grow in the shade. You can keep them pruned. I keep mine pruned basically to keep it from growing over into the neighbor's yard. And that forces me to kind of prune the whole thing. But it's a great plant. Toyon. Question. Oh, it's spelled wrong here. Toyon. Better move on up away from the ocean. Oh, we're getting up in the mountains now. Okay, let's see. We got. Okay. Well, you know what? I just mentioned the rose family. Did you know we have a wild California rose? Raise your hand if you knew that we have a wild California rose. Okay, about a quarter of you. This is it. Rosa. You ready for the species name? Rosa californica. That's right. California rose. Beautiful pink flowers. These are original rose flowers. You know, roses, like ancient roses, had just single petals. Then this is one of the most cultivated plants, right, by humans, horticulturalists. So they developed the multi-petaled roses that we're familiar with now, and of course the many, many varieties of roses. But the original California rose is a single petal, just one row of petals, of beautiful pink petals, and then they make rose hips, which are delicious. They taste like the toyon berries, basically, because that's where the rose family got its name. Rosaceae is the rose family. Now, you can grow these, but these take some maintenance because they also grow by a very aggressive root system. You're shaking your head, you've seen it. So this is where you've got to put a root barrier around these if you want to keep it contained. But then you can prune it, and there's some beautiful ones at Clough Vista Park in Ojai, which is a native plant garden, demonstration garden, right on Ojai Avenue in downtown Ojai, Clough Vista Park. I occasionally do walks there. We do workshops. Sometimes Dr. Adams was just here in September. This Dr. Adams. We did a fall medicinal plant workshop. We took a walk around Clough Vista Park to look at the native plants. There's another native plant garden a block away, the Chumash Garden at the museum. And then we went to a nearby kitchen, a church kitchen, and in the afternoon we made food and medicine from the wild plants. We made buckwheat cake, and we cracked black walnuts, made teas, prickly pears, we ate prickly pears, etc. So at the Clough Vista Park, they have some nice rose specimens where they've just kept them pruned back, just like you prune your roses in the winter. You cut them back, keep them whatever shape you want, but they didn't put a root barrier in when they planted them. So you can see they're constantly having to go in and weed the little roses that are sprouting everywhere. And these are roses, and they have thorns. They will also grow and become a vine, like a rambling rose, so you can grow them on a trellis, and then let them grow long and train them up a trellis. So there's a native California rose that you can grow. And these rose hips are the kind. You know what I mean by that? These are the good ones. These are delicious. I don't know if you ever tried to eat the rose hips off your garden roses. It's not happening. But these are good.
I didn't forget.
And anybody ever used rose hip vitamin C? Yeah, that's one of the main sources of vitamin C, right here. So California rose, these like full sun, but they will also grow in partial sun. The ones in Ojai are growing in about 50% shade, and they seem to be doing fine. Oh, that's where the water's coming from. Over there. Do you have a rag or something, Richard? There's a puddle of water here from one of the plants. Okay, so we've moved now up into the chaparral. That's the next plant community you get to once you leave Ventura and you head up. If you go up the river to Ojai, like on the bike path, then you're in the riparian habitat, which is the creekside habitat. So that's where you'll find, you can find roses, you'll find the oaks, you'll find a lot of these coastal sage scrub plants will continue to grow further up into the mountains, but they'll kind of stay closer to the creek. And then once we get up into the mountains, then you have these hard, woody, totally drought-tolerant plants. But before we leave the creek, I thought I should show you this beauty. This is this looks like the Woodwardia, isn't it? Yeah. This is Woodwardia. This is a native fern. We don't have a lot of ferns around here, in case you were wondering. But the ones we do have are basically drought-tolerant ferns, which is not what you would think. This one, though, really likes to grow in the shade, and it does like to grow. It can benefit from some moisture. This is called giant chain fern. And these will get, like this big across and this tall. They're the monster ferns of our area, but they only grow in deep, shady canyons. So you've got to have a shady place and you've got to have water. If you have those things, there's a native fern that's a beautiful plant to grow. All right. Woodwardia. Yeah. Okay. Couple of plants that you'll find up in the full sun of the chaparral. Here we go. Two more from the mint family. Okay, we've had purple sage and black sage so far. Oh, we had another sage. Thank you, hummingbird sage. That was the quiz. That's the only quiz. So don't worry, those of you that have test anxiety. So this is another sage, another true salvia. This is Salvia apiana. I know some of you might recognize this plant. The leaves, this is young, so the leaves are kind of green when they're young, and then the leaves turn white. But that's not why it has white in its name, because of the leaves. Because the flowers are white. The other sage flowers are purple. The hummingbird sage is red flowers. The purple sage and the black sage have purple flowers, but this one has white flowers. This is called white sage. Yeah. It's kind of gotten to be quite a popular plant, and wherever it grows now near trails, it's pretty much picked to the ground because it's become kind of a fad for people to use it for smudging. I know you farmers know that smudging means burning a smudge pot by your citrus trees to keep them warm in the winter. But smudging is also a very ancient practice that's been used by people forever. In fact, I know you may not have thought about it lately, but all of us evolved from some people that lived in a village somewhere, in some kind of a hut somewhere on the planet, and went out and harvested weeds and stuff, that were growing around, and knew how to use these things for food and medicine. And people have been smudging for various reasons for a long time. That means burning incense, or burning plant material for the aroma, but also out of the belief that it does some kind of a purification, some kind of a cleansing. So some scientists in India decided that they would study this smoke that comes from these plants that are traditionally burned, plants like frankincense, that's burned even in church, right? And they found that the smoke from these plants was antibacterial. So it actually was purifying the room when people were smudging with it. The most common use of this smudging was not for any particular spiritual purpose. It was burned like if someone had died from an infectious disease. Then when their body was removed from the house, then they would just inundate the house with the smoke from these terpenes, from these aromatic plants like rosemary, thyme, sage. These were plants that were traditionally burned after a person passed away, and they also are deodorizers. So it also got rid of whatever smell was there. So white sage, it's a wonderful plant, but it's got to have drainage. It grows up in the hills. You can find it occasionally down closer to Ventura, but mainly you'll find black sage and purple sage at lower elevations, and white sage as you get further up in the mountains, all the way up to 4,000 feet or higher up in the mountains. So it likes drainage. So even, if you don't live on a hill, you might want to make a little mound in your garden to put your white sage in, just to make sure it has that drainage. No, the only thing I've ever seen that gets to white sage is a gall wasp. There are wasps, they're called gall wasps, that lay their eggs in plants, and then the plants create a swelling around where the insect injected this foreign protein, because the plants act just like we do. If we get a foreign protein in our body, we have an allergic reaction to it because our body wants to get rid of it. So we create a swelling around a bee sting. The plant does the same thing. It creates a swelling on the leaf around where the wasp injected it to contain that what it perceives as a poison toxin. And then the larvae of the insect eat their way through the little gall. That becomes their larval food. So that's the only thing I've ever seen. No. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, usually overwatering is what gets plants like this. But here's the other thing I should tell you about. And let me plug this book right here. Greg Rubin wrote this book called The Drought-Defying California Garden. And I got to meet him and hear him speak here in Ventura a couple of years ago at the library. He is the leading expert now on the number one cause of death of California native plants: root aphids. And it's not just native plants that get root aphids. And do you know what carries aphids and farms aphids on your plants? Yes. Ants. Most of us are familiar with aphids on the above ground parts. It was only a few years ago that I myself learned about root aphids from a native plant nursery. The ants, the Argentine ants, which are the black ants that everybody knows, they're not native. They create super colonies. So I think someone told me that there is more total weight of ants on the planet than any other animal. And so there are quadrillions or quintillions or whatever is sextillions of ants, in these super colonies that range from Argentina, all the way up to here. So they're everywhere. And they farm aphids, and they milk the honeydew out of the aphids. The aphids suck the sugar out of your plants, and then the ants squeeze the sugar water out of the aphids, and they literally are farming it's
That's all happening in the root system.
so it's happening in the root system as well. Yeah. So when you see ants around, the chances are you have root aphids as well. So he talks about that in this book, and you can find some of his stuff online. But basically, you have to deal with the ants. So I use boric acid. There's a product you can get right here at Green Thumb. It's called Terro, Terro. They make a variety of different liquid ant baits and ant products. They're non-toxic. It's just boric acid. But the ants are attracted to the sugar, and they take the boric acid back to the queen. Ultimately, you have to get to the queen. So that could be happening with any of these plants. They could have root aphids.
It sounds like that, but it's maybe on the
Yeah. And you'll see them on the, if you pull up the roots. All right, another member, any other questions about white sage? So full sun, drainage, water it the first couple of years, then you shouldn't ever have to water it again. I have one growing, because I'm in Ojai, I can grow it in partial shade, which I'm forced to have to do. So it's a little scraggly, like things in the shade, they're reaching for the sun. So you don't get that compact look to it, but it's still growing there because I'm in a dry very dry, warm climate, but I've never watered it since the first year that I put it in. Was there another question? Yeah. Can you prune it? Yeah. Yes, you can. Yeah, if you want to, you could. Yeah, it'll come back. Yeah. Okay, another plant that grows in hot, full sun, rocky, gravelly soils. This is not one you're going to have to fertilize. But look at those beautiful flowers on there. Now, in the wild, they're not still flowering like this. You see how the flowers are blue and they're kind of curly? It's called woolly blue curls. Oh yeah, and they're kind of woolly too. See the woolly on that? Woolly blue curls. This is in the mint family also, but it's not salvia and it's not mentha, so it's not a mint, but the mint family includes, in addition to the mints and the sages, almost all the Mediterranean herbs that we use in our cooking, like oregano, thyme, marjoram, basil, savory, lavender, all in the mint family. They all have terpenes that they all grow in the Mediterranean climate. That's why they're called the Mediterranean herbs, and they all make terpenes, which not only help to prevent evaporation, just like the oil on our skin, which comes out when we get in the sun, prevents some evaporation of water. They do the same thing. The oils in the leaves are part of their protection from the sun, but also serving as insect repellents. So this would do better inland than it would do here in Ventura. It probably wouldn't be very happy right by the coast in the fog. But if you have the right place, let's see what the tag says. Shrub 2 to 4 feet high, 3 to 4 feet wide, sun or part sun. I would say down here you'd need full sun. Okay, blue curls. Oh yeah, so while we're up here in the mountains, we've got the famous yucca. Still got the old Latin name, ouch. I'll tell you about those in a second. Still got the old Latin name yucca. It's now Hespero yucca for you plant nerds, which I am one, admittedly. It's one of its common names is Our Lord's Candle because of this huge flower stalk that it puts up with this long column of yellow, white, bright yellow, white flowers, so it looks kind of like a candle. This is in the century plant family, a new family that was created. That is it's a family in the order Astragalus. So it's in the same family, not astragalus, asparagus. So that's why the stalk looks kind of like asparagus. It is related to asparagus, not the same genus, but it is related. Not even the same family. So the agaves, the century plants, those are from Mexico, but this is our local century plant. The century plant name comes from the idea that they wait like 10 years to flower. The agaves, the century, what we call century plant. So it's not really a century plant, it's like a decade plant, but they call it century plant. It seems like 100 years when you're waiting for it to flower every year. When's this thing gonna flower? But they have to get big enough to support that huge stalk, otherwise the whole thing would fall over. These are not very user-friendly to have in a small garden because, as you notice me unintentionally piercing myself on the spine on the end of this leaf, they have a very sharp spine right here. And one of the things we talk about on the walks and hikes is like, why do the plants have thorns and prickles and spines and things? Well, the obvious answer is, again, to keep predators away. This has an edible root, or it's not a root, it's the bulb. It's an underground bulb just below the surface that gets pretty big. And it's very juicy, and would be of great interest to animals, but there's no way they're going to be able to get to it with these spines here. So if you have a cactus garden and you can put this like kind of in the middle of it somewhere where nobody's going to accidentally walk into one of these, they're a beautiful thing to have. And the way they propagate is, this will take about 5 years to make a flower stalk, where the century plant might take 10 years. The mother plant will be, as it's growing big enough to make its beautiful stalk, will also be putting out little pups around it, just like cactus often do. And then the mother plant, once it flowers, it dies. But then you can remove the dead flower stalk and the dying leaves around the stalk, and then the babies will be there to take its place. You could even separate them at that point and leave one there if you only have room for one in that spot, and then you could give one to a friend or plant one, in another part of your yard. So they're kind of self-propagating that way. The leaves are an important fiber plant. You can mash the chlorophyll out of the leaves, and you're left with strands of fiber that can be twisted and braided into rope. You can make a piece of twine that's about as thick as a shoe, like my shoelaces on my boots. Okay, you can make a piece of twine about that thick. Then you can braid 3 of those together and make a cord. Then you can braid 3 of those cords together, and a 3 braid, if you know how to braid hair and stuff, I know the women mostly do. Then you can make rope with this stuff. And there's a technique for working more fiber in as you go, and you can make long ropes. That's what the Chumash did. They didn't have to learn how to install Microsoft Word on their computers. They were making stuff with their hands. They had time. The sad thing is that anthropologists have told us that Native people generally spend anywhere from 100 to 150 days a year actually working on survival. And the rest of the time they were making their costumes for their ceremonies and decorating their practical crafts with, to make them more beautiful. And just enjoying life. And we work, at least 250 days a year, if not more. It's ironic, but we're getting there, right, with all our labor-saving devices. So this is definitely, sandy soil, full sun, but it will grow in, some partial shade up in the mountains. So I think I said enough about yucca. What are we doing here? Oh. Yes, the agave, the blue agave, which is the Mexican cousin of this, is what they used to make tequila. Yeah. The California Indians did not, as far as we know, they didn't make an alcoholic beverage from this, but they took that same bulb that the Mexicans used to make tequila, and they baked it and ate it as a vegetable. And you can do the same thing with the agave bulbs too. I've seen people roast and eat those, if they don't have the means to make tequila. But you know what? I think I'm going to have to call it quits here. I think we got through a lot of the plants. It's almost noon, and we have to do the raffle, and you have to have time to come and look at the bookstore. You can buy these books here from me, and then I'll give you a little receipt that you can take with you through the check stand. And of course, all the plants are for sale, and I'll be here as long as people are here with questions. Any final questions before I wrap it up? All right, well, thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Richard for the raffle. Thank you. You're doing great.